Welcome to our Micro JC Summer of Genomics Book Club. So this is our book club for July, and we are reading and discussing this book, Fatal Invention: How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century. This is a book by Dorothy Roberts. I think she is a professor of, I looked at her biography, many amazing things. I think currently she's at the University of Pennsylvania, and she's a law and sociology position. So she is bringing a perspective from social science and law into these important discussions that we're having, especially this summer with our focus on genomics. I thought this was an excellent suggestion, which actually came from Twitter, to read this book because it brings in a social science perspective about how people are treating race in this age of genomics. So I thought this was, I had read this once before, but it was a while ago, and so it was really good for me to reread it because I in particular am going to be teaching genomics in the fall. So I'm really glad for the suggestion, and I'm glad for having read this because it really helps me think about what I want to cover for the course. So before I get launched into it, I should do the introduction. So I'm Laura Williams. I'm an assistant professor at Providence College. I almost said I'm the assistant professor. I'm an assistant professor at Providence College in Providence, Rhode Island. And I will go ahead and turn it over to Nicole, who is right next to me.
I'm unmuted now. Okay, that's fantastic. So I'm Nicole Sathya, and I am a postdoc at the University of Northern British Columbia in Prince George, British Columbia, working with very non-politicized subboreal forest microbiomes, and was very happy to read this book because I don't think I recognized how much of the sort of scientists who formed a lot of the taxonomic organizing principles we had also had some very questionable ideas about how to organize humanity, given that they thought that this was a necessary thing to do. So I'm looking forward to this discussion.
And Karen, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Karen. I'm also a postdoc. I'm at Trinity Western University, and I work with Pseudomonas and looking at immune response in Pseudomonas from C. elegans infection. And so my interest in this book, I thought this book was really fascinating, mainly because it was reorienting my own perspectives of how I perceive things. So then I learned a lot just from the parts that I did finish reading. And so I'm also looking forward to this discussion as well.
Thanks. Yeah, and thanks to you to both of you for being here. If you've watched our previous book club, we have kind of a revolving crew of people who join us, and we are always happy for new people to join us. So we have one more book club coming up for August, and the information's on our website. We're going to be reading a book called The Society of Genes. And at that point, once we finish the summer book club in August, it'll switch back over to our regularly scheduled BAT programming of Journal Club. So we are always happy to have people join us. It's really easy to join. We post the link to join the Hangout on the website. I think you may need to have a Gmail account to use the Google thing, although I'm not sure because I've got one. But you just pop in, and we always welcome new people. So if you're watching this and you're thinking, oh, I like these discussions and I would like to participate, well, we would also like you to participate. So you should feel free to get in touch with us through our website, g+microjc.wordpress.com. There's our Twitter handles are on there, which is probably the easiest way to get in touch with us. So without further ado, we'll turn it over to discussing this book. And I want to say, I think both of you have mentioned, and I said as well, I think having the social science perspective is really important for some of the issues that are raised by genomics, by understanding human diversity through genetics. I think you have to have awareness of and incorporation of a social science perspective to this. And as it happens, as I was reading this book this month, Dorothy Roberts herself is very active on Twitter, and there was a discussion happening in Twitter about this book in which a I'm going to assume this person was a laboratory scientist, essentially said to, in this Twitter thread, I don't know why I should read this because this author doesn't even have a science background. What could she possibly have to say about this? And it was just, took everything I had not to just be like, but that's not very productive. So, I mean, I will say that is a perspective that I've run across, which I always find astonishing. And I think she, in fact, does a really good job deconstructing why that's a dangerous perspective to have, to say that social science does not have anything to offer, because it really does. It really, this in particular is an excellent argument for why social science and the natural sciences should not be, have a chasm between them, that we should really be talking to each other quite a bit. So with that, my little soapbox, I thought maybe what we would start out with is there's an argument that she makes at the very beginning of the book that I think is really essential to understanding the rest of what she talks about. And that argument is basically, and she summarizes it as a couple of times, is this idea that race is not a biological characteristic. It is a political category that does not really have any biological or genetic basis. And that thesis returns many times. It's the foundation of this book to argue about why we have to be careful about how we use race in genomics research, because her argument is basically that the idea of race is a social and political concept, and it shifts with shifts in society. It's not something that you can assign to someone on the basis of biological characteristics or genetics. So I thought I would get your thoughts on that, because I think the first two chapters really expand on that idea. And probably for readers who aren't familiar with social science, it's a good way to kind of get people up to speed on this idea, because it could be, and you guys could tell me what you think, it could be that you read this and you were like, oh, I've never really thought about it like that before. I have to, full disclosure, I have to say I'm married to an anthropologist, so some of this I've heard before, so I was a little prepared, prepared for that. But I'd be curious what you guys thought about the opening part of the book where she puts that forward as an idea.
Okay, so I'm unmuted now, and I think it was really important to sort of see that emphatically expressed by Dr. Roberts multiple times, just because I read this book with a huge knowledge deficit on how slavery operated in all of the slavery chattel systems that she documents in the first opening chapters of the book. So it's very clear that these imperatives of social control and just sort of authoritative, seemingly complete explanations of why people are physiologically suited to do work, conflations of intelligence based on regimens of keeping people subjugated. I mean, it's very, very clear that like what was happening is that these are constructs that are designed for regulation of people in a utilitarian way. And it comes back later, I think, when she starts to discuss the sort of post-genome project, genome-wide association studies, where you start to see things like, we're going to define this clustering pattern as a category, which, I mean, if you've done a little bit of multivariate stats, it's like, why are you, that's not actually what we're supposed to do with this. So it's very easy to slip into it, even if you're not using it for social control, this need for categorization. I mean, in the case of the early definitions of race as it pertained to power differentials in society, there was a very explicit motivation for doing that, based on categorization to control. And science, I think that's the humbling thing, is when we come back to this data and we're looking for your summations, which sometimes end up being these categories or taxonomies, it's hard to recognize when these simplifications are actually re-echoing these historical things that are kind of bad, even if you're not aware that those polarities are kind of coming through in your work again.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, and that brings a lot of the points that she's making that I hope we'll return to as we go. But Karen, did you have any thoughts about this?
I totally agree with Nicole in that this need in science for categories makes it difficult, or I guess like when we make a summation in terms of our research, it's very difficult to not do that, because I guess the need as a scientist is you want to organize the information in a processable way, in an understandable way in which you can talk to people about it. And one of the shocking things for me when I was going through the book is the bias that was implied in the beginning of the research. So in the book, she talks about how genomic researchers choose people of what they would call pure ancestry or descent of specific categories like Asian, Caucasian, African American, and then purposely choose not to pick from areas of genomic or a lot of interbreeding, a lot of areas where people have. I'm just going to apologize on the onset that sometimes I don't have the vocabulary to address this properly. I'm going to do my best. But in the areas like the Balkans, where people have, where there's been mass migrations, where there's been war, and lots of people have intermarried and had children in different of those areas, but they're not genetically pure from the perspective of these researchers, and they purposely don't choose from those areas because it makes the analysis difficult. And so what I wanted to ask you, Laura, is from a genomic perspective, if you were to apply what your methods for categorizing bacteria in terms of genomics, is this would that be a typical way that people would do that? Like, would you pick a strain and say, okay, this is like, this is difficult for me to try to articulate, but what I'm trying to say is, how would the approach be totally unbiased? If we weren't treating it as a human population, how would we have done that for bacteria per se? Does that make any sense?
It does. And so I think what you're asking is, and so I promise I'm not going to be long-winded about this. I will answer your question. But I think you pointed out very rightly, I think both you and Nicole have said that historically we have this tendency to want to categorize, humans, I think, are just these incredible natural taxonomists who want to put things into bins and figure out how to organize them. And that was true for, in the book she talks about Linnaeus. And I've actually got a note here for a page that's like page 29, big Linnaeus fail, because he's essentially, I'm not going to read it because it's appalling, but it's basically he goes through and tries to apply a taxonomic structure to humans that is essentially just a reflection of how incredibly biased he is about human diversity. It's really, I recommend you get the book and read it so that your own jaw can drop like mine did. So I was like, Carl, geez, you are a jerk. And so I think that's our tendency with bacteria. So if you want to say, like, as an example, why do we do this? It's because in bacteria, for taxonomy, we have a tendency to do, and I'm working with this right now with our research when we're writing up what we've discovered. You have a type genus, you have a type species, you have a type strain. So if you want to say Escherichia coli, you're like, okay, so Escherichia is your genus. Your type species for that genus is going to be probably coli, although I'm not positive. And then your type strain for that species is going to be this thing. So it seems like we always have this tendency to be like, we got to have a default. We've got to have a reference. And then everything else is just as analyzed in difference to that reference. And that's one way of structuring and organizing information. And I unfortunately think that's kind of what's going on with much of, and she starts to talk about this, much of the way race is used in biomedicine and in genomics research is to say, let's find our default. Who's our default African? Who's our default European? And then let's figure out how all these other things are like different from that, or mixes of that. And you're like, what the argument that she returns to, which I think is strong, is that's not even good by genetic standards. You should be looking at populations and frequencies and distributions. And she makes the point many times, I think very eloquently, that, you know, if you take all of Africa and you try to lump all of that into this is African, she's like, come on. I've got written down here numerous times where she talks about, in chapter 3, she starts the chapter by talking about the study by Noah Rosenberg, where they use the population genetics program structure, and they look at a lot of data that they've taken from different people across the world. But in this program structure, you have to actually tell the program the number of clusters that you want it to group your data into. So I put this out on Twitter because I was curious about, like, you know, how does this work? Because that seems like a bias. And I had a few people tell me, well, there's things you can do ahead of time to try to test, like with likelihood ratio tests and things, which one fits, which number of clusters fits the data better. But I haven't read the study, so I don't know what they did. In essence, if you're saying ahead of time, I think there's going to be 5 groups, and you get 5 groups, and you go, ta-da, that means that the 5 kind of groupings that we recognize are real. You're like, but one of the things she even said for that is, with the study that they published, and I've got it written down so I didn't forget it, it says genetic differences within the populations accounted for 93 to 95% of genetic variation, whereas only 5% of the variation occurred between the groups. So this is the problem with trying to say you're going to group all of this into, you know, this is kind of what we're going to see as being African, this is what we're going to see as being European, is you're not accounting for all of the variation that can happen within a group. And this is the problem that we're having. It doesn't have, obviously, nearly the same societal consequences, but this is the problem that we're having in bacterial taxonomy, which is that you've got the difference between an E. coli that makes you sick and an E. coli that just sits in your gut and makes vitamin K for you, genes-wise, is a small proportion, but it's a pretty big difference. So we don't account for that variation very well. And I think that's the argument she's making too, is that by trying to force people into these categories, we're actually ignoring a tremendous amount of the variation and the allele frequencies and the overlap that occurs. You know, she spends a lot of time talking about migration between the north of Africa and Europe. So are those people not African? Like, how do you could get into all kinds of things with that. And I will say too, to Karen's point, yeah, I mean, I do not also have access to all the vocabulary and the language that's used to discuss this. So we're just going to do our best in good faith. And if certainly if people are watching this and have some thoughts, I definitely welcome them. But I think all of us here kind of are coming at this from the same spirit of trying to understand the arguments that she's making. And now I'm done.
So essentially what she's saying is that to analyze the like, one of the things that, as I was reading this book, is like, okay, so how can we approach this fairly? How can we do this properly? So by analyzing population distribution, so would that have to be blind then? Like, when you collect the sample, you wouldn't take an ancestry or a racial marker. Is that what the better way of analyzing it would be?
I think there's definitely an argument for that. I think you could, and it kind of depends on your purpose. So she's also very careful in the book to say that this isn't to say that you should not look at race, because as she has a couple of chapters that point out, there are health disparities along racial lines. Many of that has to do with environmental impacts, societal impacts that are predominantly borne by people from a certain racial group. So she goes through the idea of breast cancer rates in white women versus black women. And you can look at the factors that play into that. The rate at which they have access to mammograms, the quality of the hospitals that they have. Once they get diagnosed with cancer, how far away are they from high quality hospital cancer centers? So she's very careful to say, you know, you don't want to completely ignore this. But if what you're looking for instance, is a way to identify, like she brings up an example of a young black girl who had respiratory problems starting from the age of 2. and so many respiratory problems, sees all these doctors, and finally somebody was just looking at her chest x-ray when she was 8, I think, and said, "Oh, who's the kid with cystic fibrosis?" And nobody had thought to test her for this because cystic fibrosis is a white person's disease. So I think the point she's trying to make is, what are you trying to do? If you're trying to improve medicine, then what you need to be looking for is, are there alleles that are associated with certain diseases? Look for those. Don't assume that because somebody's Black, they must not have this allele, or if somebody's Native American, they must not have this allele. You have to become more refined than that. And so what a couple of people that she interviews basically say, I mean, pre-screening patients based on race is like in the Stone Age, you know, and then you're going to use this tool, this scalpel of genomics, after you've already bludgeoned somebody with something as crude as race. You know, I think the argument that she's making for medicine is that you've got to become more refined in what you're looking for. I don't know if that answers your question, Karen.
Right. I think I'm trying to tease out like in what situations would applying race be appropriate, and what situations would applying race be inappropriate. And I think what I'm understanding from what you're saying, because I haven't, full disclosure, I haven't completely finished the book, is that she's saying that in situations where race becomes a blinding factor in which you make assumptions, that's inappropriate, because then that brings in potentially past social constructions or societal stereotypes that have been ingrained over generations. But to use race as a form of medical understanding, where but not to separate that from the way that these people have lived their lives or have access to healthcare because of that disparity. So using race in the context with that disparity is appropriate. Is that correct?
I think that's a good description. Nicole, do you have thoughts on that?
I have a couple that may stray from Karen's sort of line of thinking, but I think there's something even bigger and more uncomfortable to acknowledge with this. And I mean, the example of the 8-year-old girl with the CF lung, that a clinician knew what the clinical features of a CF lung are, means that there should actually be a pluralistic awareness by people who look at lungs all the time as to what this looks like, without even having to look for a single gene mutation, which is the other thing about this, is it's not a polygenic, like this would have been obscure. If you had decided to go the route of actually testing for that, you would have found it, because it's one of those few diseases that fits really nicely into a Mendelian inheritance pattern. It's the fact that as policymakers, and I think as scientists who interface with the public, where there's such a vested interest on preserving human life, that admitting from the get-go that we're not even sure we should be looking for a genetic risk factor from the beginning. We don't get to say that. I mean, it's not that, because there's that public trust part of it, that we're experts. So if you have a disease that you're trying to address, and you only choose to frame studying it from the genomic or the genome-wide category, but you aren't doing the epidemiology to look at whether the distribution of where your population or your sample, if there is a proportion of representation by race, but it might also be by geography. It might be by their proximity to a wastewater treatment plant, by their time to admission to a hospital, by the time they get staged for the disease that they have that you're interested in. So we talk about refinement, but what we're actually talking about, when I think that we might need concurrent and interdisciplinary inspection of a bunch of risk factors, is the fact that we might need the kitchen sink approach, which some scientists don't like either. But the truth is, genes may not be at the center of what you need to figure out. So what I guess I'm sort of saying we should be doing is the most expensive option, and it's the one that policymakers don't like because it's not the most parsimonious option, but it is the one that we need because the one that will involve the expertise of people who can sort of be like, we are actually seeing the effect of high-risk socioeconomic disparities or high-risk geographic disparities that are the actual risk factor that leads to these diseases. Because in a lot of cases, we're not talking about pathologies that have really simple causalities like bacterial infection, although you could make the argument with antibiotic resistance that these are now moving back into the chronic thing. But I mean, if we're talking about cancers and we're talking about heart disease, we're talking about multifactorial etiology from the get-go. And that's the other part that I think isn't directly addressed in the book, but it's part of this, is just that the public trust in capturing the public's imagination with not just racialized medicine, but genomic medicine, is that there's this explanatory power in this section of biology that isn't really there, because these diseases by nature have multiple steps to get tissues and organs and the whole person's well-being to the complex level of hard to treat symptoms that you end up with. So that really didn't answer your question, but I think it addressed some of what I think needs to happen in terms of research design, like what is towards a better way. And I think it's actually doing epidemiology and centering that, with the genomic part being a subsection of that epidemiology.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I thought I would just, this occurred to me because I'd written this down too. She's very, I wonder if when she had like test readers, because this book came out in 2011, so I wonder if she had people read this who, I appreciate the fact that she returns to her argument that race is not biological or genetic, it's political, it's social. She returns to that many times, and I think that's good, because you can kind of find yourself going, yeah, but what about, and she anticipates a lot of, yeah, but what about, she's like, you might be saying, but what about, here's why that's not, which I thought was good. I think it's a, yeah, it's well constructed. But I just wanted to point out, she's got, in reference to what we're talking about from Karen's question, on page 129, she's talking about different ways that environmental influences can, or environmental factors can influence health disparities along racial lines. And so one thing she's clear to say is she basically stops in the middle of the page and she says, okay, so this is where many people get confused. So let me be clear. Race is not a biological category that naturally produces health disparities because of genetic differences. Race is a political category that has staggering biological consequences because of the impact of social inequality on people's health. And I think that's what Nicole is also getting at, which is this idea that to ignore, and I think she certainly does not claim in here that you should ignore race, which I think might be what Karen's question is going for too, which is, I think what she's arguing here is ignoring it is wrong because it's real. It's a real social and political category that has real biological consequences, but those consequences aren't rooted in a genetic explanation. They're oftentimes rooted in things that are part of the social construct and the framework that we have for race, certainly in the United States. And so I think, Nicole, I think your point is excellent. This idea that you need a multidisciplinary approach. And ironically enough, what's going on right now is that we're having debates about healthcare and who's going to pay for it. And I think there is a market for simplified explanations that point to genes and go, that's responsible for all of this, rather than saying, actually, you might have to improve people's housing situation if you're going to make any headway on this. And that's expensive and nobody wants to do it and nobody wants to pay for it, but there you are. There's no pharmaceutical product. There's nothing that you can sell. You just have to do it. But I don't know, Karen, does that?
Yeah, that's, I think it's because it's beyond the places that I've read in the book. So it's probably, so that's, no, I'm glad that that has cleared things up for me. And I also think that Nicole made a very like articulate response about like how we need to have multifactorial studies. What I'm wondering is that because For example, I was trained in a very isolated discipline in terms of thinking. So then are we limited because we don't have access to the collaborations that we need to form these connections? Or is it because we're limited? Are we limited in any way by statistics? I think that's my question. Is it because do we have the foundation or a framework scientifically to study multifactorial factors?
I'm going to take that one because I've actually taken a little bit of epidemiology, like a teeny weeny bit in my first degree. So there are research designs, and this is why I actually feel like all biologists should actually take an epidemiology course, because you basically are dumped into what's called the mess of humanity. Like, none of your research designs actually look like what you can get away with bacteria. Like, longitudinal studies are like the gold standard. So like if you talk about studies like Framingham or Karelia, which are considered sort of like the best case, we have a population of healthy people and we've got them signed up and we're going to follow them for 10 to 20 years, possibly until they die, and get like anthropometric measurements and cardiovascular measurements. And then we can just see who drops out or who gets what condition. Really expensive, not going to really answer a lot. But I mean, those are the studies that give you things like your relative risk ratios. So in terms of the stats, I mean, epidemiology has a repertoire of correlational numbers that you can get, and they're usually expressed in terms of these sort of risk probability type indices, you know? And I mean, there's all sorts of debates about the p-value hacking and that sort of thing. It's been like over 20 years since I've had to think about it. But I mean, there are definitely designs. And I think the nice thing about us, you know, we have very core sort of bench skills that trying to figure out how we would sample and how we characterize as sort of a piggyback onto an epidemiological study is something that I feel should happen, as long as there's really good communication about when samples are coming in, getting them at their most high quality part. Because I mean, I know you haven't finished the book yet, Karen, but there's a section in there about the amount of genetic data being collected by the US legal system. And they talk a lot about poor sample handling and the legal implications of bad data. So the stewardship responsibilities of both. And I mean, usually if you're doing really high level epidemiological stuff, your ethics reviews are going to be like thick, your applications. So I'm hoping in most cases that the norm of that sector of science combined with somebody coming in would probably dictate a high level of sort of foresight to make sure that things go the right way. So I feel like those collaborations can and should be happening. It's the question of like how to get more communication, I guess. And I feel like with the Human Genome Project, a lot of that happened in centers like the Chromosome 7 lab at University of Toronto. I mean, that was already in a children's hospital. So you're already like in the clinician epidemiologist milieu. So I feel like with at least some of the genomic medicine stuff, that's already kind of a place where that kind of exchange is happening. But again, I'm not 100% sure about that. So that's what I have to say.
Yeah, I think that's I agree with you. I think that the epidemiology kind of has a unique way of looking at things that laboratory scientists maybe would do well to be exposed to. I thought that one of the things that I wanted to do, because I know I think a couple people, there's only just a couple of people here. I know Karen has to leave early, Nicole might have to leave a little bit early. So I did want to talk about in particular, and it could be that you guys haven't gotten this far in the book. That's another feature of the book club. We don't do quizzes, so you don't have to actually finish the book. But I was reading this from the perspective of thinking about how can I teach some of this content in my class. And I actually think that this chapter, it's chapter 9. I'm guessing Karen probably didn't get to that one. Nicole, did you get to that one? Maybe.
I did. I did read the whole thing. It's just that I
Okay.
don't know what the chapters are called because the
No,
digital
that's okay.
is weird. So,
Oh, right, you had it on the Kindle, yeah.
yeah.
So, so this is, what I'm thinking I might do is I might actually have the students read this chapter. I probably want them to read maybe the introductory chapter to orient them with this idea of what are we talking about when we talk about race. But this is called Race in the New BioCitizen. And it was really striking to me because it's very broad, but it talks about things like direct-to-consumer genotyping, like 23andMe. It talks about collecting genomic and genetic data from people. So the fact that 23andMe will take this data and you are agreeing by submitting your sample to them to contribute your genotype to large-scale studies of human genetics. It also talks about the fact that, and I don't know where this is, but let's see, oh yeah, okay. So this was written in 2011, so I don't know where we are with this, but it says the United States military is also planning to conscript soldiers to be biocitizens. The Department of Defense asked a group of scientist advisors to consider the impact of anticipated advances in genome sequencing technology over the next decade and assess how the armed forces could take advantage of genomic information about their personnel. So I don't know, it's been a few years since the book was written, so I don't know if the US military is doing this, but the suggestion here is that they're at least considering sampling every member of the armed forces and then analyzing their genomic DNA to see if they can determine where they should be deployed, what their risk factors might be for certain things. And then she talks about different ideas about genetic screening.
Yeah. Sorry,
So,
Laura, just have to interrupt you for 1 second. I have to go.
Oh, yep, okay. Thanks,
Okay.
Karen.
All right, take care.
Yep. So she ends up talking about genetic screening, basically. So she ends up discussing prenatal testing, I guess. And so the idea here is kind of reproductive biotechnology and reproductive genetics. And then, and I thought this was really striking, it's basically, you're still, just like we talked about, you're still dealing with risk factors. But the question now becomes is, if you have access to this test and you get back probabilistic information about risk, but no certain answers, what now are your obligations as a biocitizen, which is a term she uses in here, you know, for bearing children? And so she discusses how this might differ by race because people have different access to different types of healthcare. So for instance, a Down syndrome child, you know, if you have prenatal testing and you have evidence that your child has Down syndrome, do you choose to terminate the pregnancy? And how do different factors, societal factors, play into that? I thought that was really, I thought this was a really good chapter that hits people in a lot of different ways. So I thought it would be useful to have students read this. And I don't know, for me, I was thinking, I don't know if I want to do a traditional discussion because I think with things like this, students kind of know what they think you want them to say. So what I think I would rather have them do is just pick out something that they found either particularly shocking or particularly, you know, something that really hit them and have them look into it a little deeper. So for instance, if the military thing, if they were like, oh my God, did they do that? Like have them go out and try to kind of collect some information about where are we with this now? Like what's going on with this and what do you think about it? I don't know. What, Nicole, do you have any thoughts on that from a teaching perspective?
I do, because I actually think that's, so I like that you've chosen that section because, I mean, in terms of student engagement, that's probably going to be one of the better sections of the book because 23andMe sits in this very weird, like, at the conference I was at last week, I mean, a couple of my old mentors, it seemed like, had taken the test and I still haven't. So it's interesting to see, you know, people who do genetics, in spite of the limitations of these types of tests for interpretation, using them. I looked into that and I was surprised that it actually did have a panel of disease susceptibility genes because I was just like, so you're okay with marketing this to people with minimum clinical oversight? Because I mean, another question that could come up reflectively with students is, what are your expectations about the doctor-patient relationship? Because direct-to-consumer tests kind of bypass that kind of consultation as a process. But I also like the idea you have, though, about kind of making students be reflective about what resonates with them, because the military plans on genomically profiling their conscriptees or their personnel. It's interesting to hear that as well, because up here with some of the MyTax policy fellowships, some of the working documents that have come out of there haven't really been genomic, but there have definitely been projects that looked at physical enhancements for soldiers. So these ideas of mechanical and physical, and I mean, the investigational backgrounds of the scientists they bring in to look at this are kind of interesting too, because some of them are people with expertise in hormones, kinesiology. So like these intersections of the military with branches of medicine and biology that don't come to mind to me immediately. Clearly people are thinking about optimizing the human, I'm just going to be blunt and say it, as a commodity. And it's a weird thing to think about. We're both in pseudo teaching professions where we see people more as things we nurture, even if we don't talk about it. So it's a very weird angle to take, right? I mean, on what we're doing with humans in a workforce. So I think that's an excellent idea to teach from that particular chapter.
Yeah, I agree with you. That is, yeah, I think treating people as a commodity is a really accurate way to put that. And kind of, this topic isn't within that chapter, but I think you already brought it up, this idea that within the criminal justice system, that you are treating everybody as a potential suspect. So she has a couple chapters where she talks about DNA collection from people who, it used to be, I guess, the considered practice was people who were convicted of a felony, of a certain, like a violent crime in particular. So they would take DNA samples from them. But now it's expanded to people who are arrested. So they're not even necessarily charged, they're just arrested. And so the people are equating it with taking a mugshot and a fingerprint, but their DNA sample is getting stored. And it's used for whenever they're screening samples, you know, if a rape kit comes in or there's a DNA sample taken from the scene of a murder, they're going to be screening it against all the samples they have. And, you know, largely there are many ethical issues with that. But then on the topic of race, she makes a very, very well-supported point that because Black and brown people interact with the police at a higher rate, they are going to be in that database at a higher rate, not because they are criminals at a higher rate, but because of police enforcement and the way that they approach policing communities. And so you're going to get your chances of being falsely accused of a crime are going to be higher if you're in the database versus not. So I thought that was an excellent chapter too. And we're still struggling with that.
Yeah, I mean, that was also, I mean, as a Canadian reading that and not familiar with the American system of policing, I mean, the fact that these are actually things that happen, they're practices, they're policies of that industry, which makes me understand better now when I read people who are outspoken about policing as a procedure of law enforcement possibly needing to go or being reformed, if not eliminated. This is what they're talking about, is how holistic these aspects of profiling are. And page 266, which I think is the one that said that there were 8 million sequences in the national whatever repository of suspects, I guess, or of people who have had DNA collected by law enforcement in the US. I mean, that is a massive amount of data and kind of makes you wonder, like, what is transparency about their data management plans like? We're struggling with that in the sciences. I can only imagine what that may or may not look like from there.
Yeah, and I the point too that she talks about with this, and this is an excellent point, that if you get a false match, people are just trained to think that DNA is infallible, even though the DNA is being processed by people who are by nature fallible people, who will make mistakes, who will swap samples. And the idea that, I mean, it's an interesting chapter that she talks about this, because you do have to balance that with exoneration of people who were falsely convicted. on the basis of, witness statements or other very error-prone evidence. And there's been a number of cases where DNA evidence has allowed people to be exonerated and released from prison terms that they should not be serving. And so she does argue, yes, that's a benefit from this, but you can't not think about the consequences just because you have these benefits. You can't not think about what about the false positives? What about who's being represented in these databases? Because it is, by large proportion, it's disproportionately going to be African American and Latino people in the United States who are in these databases, just because of the way policing works. Part of me wonders if she has updated, if she's written more. I know she's written a couple of books, but I wonder if she has essays or things where she's returned to some of this, because it's been 6 years, probably 7 or 8 years since she was doing all the data collection for this. So I kind of wonder where we are with some of this. Some of these things, I think it's probably worse. Yeah, I don't know. Nicole, I don't want to keep you if you have to. When do you have to run off?
I moved my meeting to 1:30, so I can basically kind of go to, if we want 10 minutes to wrap up, I can do it.
Okay. Yeah. Boy, this was such an excellent book. I really enjoyed reading it. Is there anything that we haven't hit on that you wanted to bring up?
There are lots of things. I mean, I was actually just kind of also very overjoyed that she quoted Kimberly Tallbear, who's talked a lot about, indigeneity claims and the limits of DNA, and even whether it fits into the moral imperatives of claiming, First Nations affiliation, because there are other conventions and sort of rules of conduct and morality that dictate sharing that information in the first place. I remember there's one section of the book where they had one of those televised ancestry things, and they had one participant who was First Nations who refused to supply DNA because it was their belief that the ownership of that information actually extended to the full, I'm not sure if the word tribe was used necessarily, but basically to the whole affiliation. It wasn't just that individual's decision to make. And I think that's the forgetting that ethics are about systems of decision making and who stakeholders are. I mean, we're used to the ones that run our countries, the capitalist framework, and that's what we see all the time, but there are these other ones that are equally important. And genetics is not, it's sort of been put on a pedestal in many ways in terms of information reliability, as you've mentioned, with forensic testing, information reliability with disease diagnosis, and just this idea of whether it can accurately represent things that I think we've basically conflated a gene composition to mean. And the ancestry question can be addressed to some extent by DNA, but what are people using that information for, and what attributes of ancestry are valued by different communities is another thing that I think Dorothy Roberts is very good at bringing up. And another reason why I think, to address that person on Twitter, why scientists should read this book is because we aren't really using scientific decision-making and a lot of other societally contentious things that we use to navigate throughout our daily lives. I mean, we judge right and wrong by very different systems that are very personal, and we evaluate other things that we do in our life by things that don't necessarily look like what we're doing at the bench or what we're doing to get peer review. So, I mean, the social dynamics and the political frameworks that are sometimes manipulating us, or sometimes the ones that we inform, are really telling us about what we think this information should be used for and where it sits in decision making for society.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. And I have two thoughts on that are probably going to be fairly disjointed, so I apologize for that. One is you mentioning the idea that as we are scientists, so we're kind of acculturated to see things as being, these are facts, these are factual things that you could test with the scientific method. And I think that's why some people have a tendency to be dismissive of the social scientists. There's this idea that it's just simply not as rigorous as laboratory science. And And that all is how you assign value to things. So, you know, what do you mean by rigorous? What do you mean by why is that important? So forth. But I thought one thing that she addresses in the book that was really interesting that gets to that point is in the beginning of the part where she was discussing medicine, biotechnology, and how race gets used in that. She was talking to a number of researchers who use race as a way of organizing their data. And one of the things that I think she did that was very instructive was to ask them to classify themselves into the categories that are crudely used in their research subjects, and they cannot do it. So, you know, for people who have, I mean, for me, I could do it, I'd be like, I'm white. But if you're talking to people who have different backgrounds like she does, she talks about her own background herself and how her parents are from very different parts of the world. And there are a number of people that she runs across who are studying this, who have similar backgrounds, and they, to a person, appear to be incapable of applying to themselves the categories that they're using to try to chunk their research subjects and their research participants into, which just shows you, as she points out, it just shows you how imperfect, how as scientists we kind of value the rigor of data testing and all the variables that we need to try to control, but yet we're willing to just kind of go, you know, and just throw people into these categories that are horribly defined and maybe even not meaningful. So I thought that was a really good point to emphasize why this is an important thing and why it's a problem that we need to address a little bit better. But yeah, and I'm so glad you brought up, this is why it's disjointed, this was my other thought. I'm so glad you brought up the section about First Nations people, and also looking at, I think there's a section too where she talks a little bit about people tracing Jewish ancestry. And so this idea of, because this really gets into, you know, what anthropologists are looking at in terms of culture. So there's an example that she uses where, I think it was in England, there's a Jewish primary school that accepts people from all faiths, but gives priority to people from who are, I guess, considered have Jewish ancestry or are considered to be kind of ideally Jewish. I don't really know how you figure that out, but basically they had it was a woman who converted to the Jewish faith, and then her son. So her son was practicing, and the family is practicing in the Jewish faith, and they applied to get into the school and they were denied. And part of it was because she couldn't produce the ancestry that other people could produce, and so therefore she should not get priority. But her argument was essentially, I don't understand why you're rejecting, why you're valuing genetics, supposedly, and ancestry over the actual practice of the faith. So you could have somebody come in and get priority who doesn't even practice, but can produce the right documents or produce the right genetic testing to say, oh yeah, I'm related to all these people, so you should let me in. And it's this idea that you know, you've got to think about what's the significance of these categories. It's much more beyond just how many markers do you have, how many things can we match, especially when you're getting into things like deciding membership in communities and what that means. That was rambling, but I'm glad you brought that up.
No, I'm glad you brought up that example as well, because I mean, it's very clear that there's a bunch of other lines of criteria that, you know, need to be debated for their validity. And also, I mean, practicing a faith is doing the work of an ideology, right? I mean, so that is a very solid repertoire of things that are being done. So what is its worth in the context or alongside a genetic identity? I mean, those are questions we really do have to ask ourselves when we think about applying genetics as an assignment to any category that humans make. Because yeah.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Because again, I mean, now we're talking about categorizations within society that aren't exclusively biological, right? I mean,
yeah, definitely.
These are things that are almost exquisitely human, our practicing of faiths and our need for social organization. So I mean, by that alone, I mean that conversation cannot even be done exclusively scientifically. Like it can't, it shouldn't.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's interesting too, because while I was reading this book, what popped up in my, and I don't know if this is a new campaign or if I just noticed it because I was reading this book, but 23andMe is currently advertising a trip that they will pay for if you win based on your DNA. And it seriously is, the tagline is something like tour the world based on your DNA. So like you're going to send your DNA to them, they're going to send back to you, here are all the parts of whatever you are, your percentages or proportions, and you can now plan your world tour based on what they say that your DNA tells you about yourself. So that's still very current. Okay, so we are running up to our hour, and I know, Nicole, you've got a meeting you've got to get to. This is such a good book. I feel like I could talk about it for a really long time. But I will say, as a closing statement, and then Nicole, feel free if you've got some closing thoughts. But I was mentioning this to a couple people that I've been talking to about this book, but I really feel like this should just be a required reading for anybody going to medical school, anybody going into genetic counseling. I really feel like they need to read this, because I think all three of us, Karen included, I don't think she would mind me saying this for her. I think this was very eye-opening for all of us in reading this, to think about these issues and think about the very real consequences of not critically looking at the way that we interpret race in genomics. There are very real consequences to it, and I think she makes that argument very eloquently. So my hope is that many people going into medicine and going into genetic counseling too will encounter these ideas, hopefully through this book, but otherwise through other means. Nicole, do you have any kind of closing thoughts?
They're going to be short, but basically I agree with everything you've said in terms of making this sort of a required reading for genetics or pre-med students, or even students who have to like talk about molecular DNA data at any point in their curriculum, just because it's easy to oversell this. And I think equipping especially young people with the ideas about the limitations of what this information can yield, and also talking about social gradients and missteps in the interpretive value of this data are an important thing to have sort of a wider consciousness of as we communicate to people who are older than us, who know less, or people younger than us, to understand what our technologies mean and what they don't mean yet, and where the conflicts with our problems as a society are in determining what this science should be used for.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. So thanks to Karen, who had to depart early, and thanks to you, Nicole. I really appreciate that you guys read the book and then joined me for this, because this was very thought-provoking. It was really interesting to hear your thoughts on it. So that concludes our July book club discussion, and then we are going to have one more, as I mentioned, so that'll be in August, date and time to be determined, but that will be on a book called The Society of Genes, and you can find it on our website, which should actually be linked in the description for this video if you're watching this on YouTube, which is, I assume, what you're doing. So thanks again to Nicole, and thanks to everybody for watching, and we will see you next time.